that I'm going to talk, which has been adapted from a salivary endoscope, which is used to visualize the Stenson's duct. And it actually is a 0.6 millimeter endoscope, and which has a port which is there, and this port is for irrigation. You can also customize and make a port separately to have something like a Dormia basket, where in case if there is any dacrylith, you can go and use the basket to remove that one. And the other end is very compatible with Vedic Calso's endoscope, and this is the endoscopes that we have, so it's quite compatible because it's from the same thing. Just briefly to take you, if you can please dim the slides. Excuse me. If you can please dim the slides, it will be much easier to visualize that. When we go through with the dactyl endoscope, this is how the canaliculi looks like. Canaliculi is usually a bit whitish mucosa with a central lumen, which end on appears like a bit transparent. You can see the difference in the color. That means that is the place where you are going to go in that direction based on the color perceptions as it changes. Then you go through the lumen. But as you come into the lacrimal sac, initially you would find that the illumination is very less. This is the point where the illumination should now be increased to have a good view of the lacrimal sac. This is the sac, and I'm at the sac, and I'm looking at the nasolacrimal duct here. And this, what you see, is the lowermost part, valvular part of the lacrimal system. Now, it's not a Hasner's valve, obviously it's not a Hasner's valve, but then there are numerous such folds that you would come across in a normal system, which is very important for the flow of the tears. These are examples of the mucosal folds that you see in the nasolacrimal duct. There are many things that it has a diagnostic indication, like canalicular stenosis, like you see here, and it's a bit more stenose in this particular area. It could be a partial canalicular obstruction, like you can see the hazy. Most of the time the fibrosis looks a bit hazy and whitish, and this is an example of a complete canalicular obstruction, like you can see here. This is the mucosa, the red one that you see, and the entire thing is a chunk of the fibrous clot. So the aim of the study was to study the efficacy of dactyloendoscopic guided recanalizations of the canaliculi and the nasolacrimal duct. This was a prospective interventional study which included 20 lacrimal passages with a mean age of 27.2 years, because most of them also had the nasolacrimal duct. But what is significant is that while dealing with the congenital population, there were people who had undergone syringing more than once. I'll just very briefly take you through the videos of how a canalicular obstruction or how it actually appears. Yeah, if you can see, this is how the canaliculi appears. It's very important not to touch the endoscope to the canalicular wall, because it may suddenly spontaneously start bleeding. A very good indication is, if you can see at the end of it, there will be a lot of folds, and it's like an accordion kind of tube. So you should be very careful when you go in. And at the distant end, you start seeing now a reflection of light that the endoscope is pushing. So just go towards that. There you see it's coming into your view. And at the distal canaliculus, you're still going forward, and there you see bang on, it's a complete canalicular obstruction. Thank you. And the same thing, once we go with the cystoscope that Dr. Grover talked in the morning, you can go ahead and under endoscopic visualization, you can neatly punch out the segment that is obstructed. And I'll skip this, and the same patient, I'll just show you how it appears post-operatively. There's the same thing. So what you see is that you see a lot of, the fibrovascular tissue. Once you refine it, you would see that there is a bit of blood somewhere there, and that's where when you should use a port. See, there's a bleed on the surface of it from there, but you can still see that it is quite patent now. But you should just wash out to see the patency appropriately. Now see, I'm using the side port to flush the canaliculi, and there you can see it's disappearing, and then you can see at the base there is still a bit of it which is not going to matter, because it's now entire opening is quite clear. So this is a very easy way to go back and again check. But what is also important, and where I would like to stress, is the dactyloendoscopic guided probing along with the nasal endoscopic guided. This is a case of a nasal child who has undergone twice syringeal probing, and you can see at multiple levels. This is a sac duct junction where I am at present. You can see at multiple levels there are on the wall. Here on the wall you can see there is a fibrous tissue, and then this is the sac duct junction. You can see, and then there is a nice chunk of fibrous tissue over here on this side. And at multiple levels you find that there is a chunk of fibrous tissue, probably because of the past probing also, and obviously of pathology. You can see there's a good amount of chunk. And then this is, once I enter the sac, I find that this area is a bit reasonably clear. So most of the problem for this child was in the nasolacrimal duct. So obviously you go ahead and this is the nasal endoscopy view of the probe in the inferior meatus. So you make sure that you cleared everything under the guidance from both the canalicular side as well as the dactyloendoscopic, as well as the nasal endoscopy side, and then you go back again and check. And now see, you see only at the periphery. You can see a very thin plaque attached to the periphery. This is a small one that needs to be washed out. And you can see again a rim here of the remnant fibrovascular tissue, and you can also see a bit of bleeding over there. But fair enough, a good, nice opening without any kind of obstruction, and it is not bleeding quite heavily. It just means that you are not being very aggressive on the mucosa of the nasolacrimal duct. And then obviously, once we do that, we need to go ahead and again go through the nasal endoscopy once you have cleared everything, and obviously this is the proper intubation that I am doing. So we retain the intubation for a period of 12 weeks with a 6 months minimum follow-up post-tube removal. Anatomical success was defined as patency on irrigation, and functional success was defined as absence of epicora. And this is what is the anatomical and functional success rate were 60% for canalicular recanalization and 70% for nasolacrimal duct. But this is at 6 months. That's what is important. And we found that of the 7 lacrimal passages, 6 reoccluded, those among the good failures, 6 reoccluded after the tube removal, and 1 had stent prolapse, but there were no false passages. So in conclusion, I would say that dactyloendoscopic guided recanalization of the lacrimal passage is an emerging technique to perform a complete recanalization. It has a very steep learning curve, and it needs probably years of more experience to be able to come to a point where we might be able to avoid a diagnosis to endoscopy. Thank you so much.
Good presentation. This instrument is very good instrument through which we can see from the puncture to the opening of the nasolacrimal duct into the nose. And whatever we do, we will have revelation. So chances of success are very, very high. I started using this instrument in 2008, and luckily I was studying there in 2009. If I got to find a best paper award on the same topics in 2009. That was at that time for innovation and analysis of surgery. So Dr. Nimish, good presentation, but you have to be long follow-up.
Yes.
So because this is a good time, but two problems come in the way. Number one is the learning curve. Very difficult to handle instrument, very costly instrument. At the time I don't know, at the time it was 20 lakh rupees when I purchased in 2008. Now it is costly. Second, the handling of the instrument is very cozy. You have to clean the instrument very cleanly. Second thing is learning curve is very difficult and long curve. So we need a long follow-up for building the system.
I totally agree. Yes. What is ideal is to use a side port. No, we don't need it. Yes, I agree. That's a very, very valid point and a very nice point. But what we need to do is we need to use a side port to irrigate one before we intervene. Oh yes, we have to. No, those endoscopes. Exactly. Exactly. So yes, I totally agree with you. What is very important is to dilate those passages before we go in, and that's what I do. Yes, that's very good. Gas. The thing is that gas retention is not very good in the system because okay. So it is taken. So yes, that's a very valid point. Thank you.
Last paper and yes, sorry, sir. Revision of failed external DCR, our experience from a tertiary eye care center by Dr. Shamir Mohabatra.
Good afternoon all, respected members of the dais and seniors and colleagues. I thank all for this opportunity to discuss our experience. We have no financial disclosures in this presentation. As you all know, external DCR is a gold standard technique with a success rate of around 90%. Though there is an emerging trend towards endoscopic surgery, still the preferred technique is continuously evolving, and the main purpose is to find or to create an anatomical and functional pattern of the lacrimal duct. Now, various factors have been identified in failure of DCRs, maybe which are caused in the ostium or in the canalicular or nasal pathology, or a surgeon related. But overall, when we find any revision of unsuccessful surgery can be done either through an external or endoscopic approach, and the revision, the success rate is close to 80%. With this background, we can see a number of failed cases in our institute. The purpose of our study is to analyze the clinical profile and outcome of revision surgery done in cases of failed primary external diaphragmatic endoscopy cases. The study is a retrospective design conducted at L. Prasad Eye Institute, Bhubaneswar from June 2006 to June 2013. In this, we reviewed the medical records of all patients included, and all the patients had a detailed ophthalmic history and a comprehensive ocular examination, including syringing to check for potential of the lacrimal system. An informed consent was obtained from all the patients. Now, a patient who presented to us with history of persistent epiphora, a history of prior sac surgery with a documented evidence of sac surgery done either in the institute or elsewhere, or with a visible scar and having non-potential lacrimal system were included in the study, as shown in this pictures. And we excluded all other causes of failed DCR like endoscopic, endoplasia, endocanalicula, or failed DCR due to trauma. We have 49 patients, 49 eyes of 47 patients, and we followed them for more than 3 months, and ultimately 38 patients were considered for final analysis of the outcomes. Females were more commonly affected than males, and the commonest age group of our patients were between 21 to 60 years, the range from 4 to 80 years. Epiphora was the most common presentation. However, in 4 cases, presented with acute dacrocystitis, and 3 of them had lacrimal abscess. Now, considering the most important aspect that around 42 patients or 42 eyes had prior surgery, only one surgery has been done prior to a revision surgery, and out of them, when we have revised, the success rate was close to 97%. And in 7 cases, more than two surgeries have been performed, and the success rate was close to 100%. Depicting that there was no difference in this outcome. Out of 49 eyes, 9 cases were institutional failure, means most of the cases were done by fellows, as ours is a training institute. And 40 cases or 40 eyes, around 82% were extra institutional cases which were referred to us. It is very important to note that the time to fail in institutional cases were rough, mostly at around 6 weeks, whereas for institutional or extra-institutional cases it was around 1.5 years. This could be explained on the basis of because of the late referral pattern in our settings. Now, 28 eyes or 57% of the patients were revised with DCR, MNC, and intubation, and 5 eyes had to undergo a DCT procedure, which is very unlikely or unfortunate because 4 of the eyes had got an ocular comorbidity like endophthalmitis and subluxated cataract, for which visual rehabilitation was necessary to be done early. Now, the most important aspect of our study was to find out the possible cause of failure. What went wrong with the prior surgery? We found out that granulation tissue at the ostium was the single most common factor of failure in about 31% of the eyes. Whereas, if you note the 10 eyes or about 20% of the cases had an inadequate ostium, an intact sac flap, and an intact nasal flap. This indicates that the surgery was started or initiated, was giving us a false impression of a scar or a false impression that surgery was done, but actually there was no surgery done, or the surgery was abandoned in the middle because of unknown reasons. Now, in other cases like intact sac flap or intact nasal flap, if you club together all together, it amounts to about 45% of the cases where the entire abnormality lies with the sac flap, nasal flap, or with the ostium. Now, a very good example to depict this finding is this old 60-year-old lady where a DCL was done on the left eye, which failed, and when we revised, we found extensive granulation tissue over the ostium. We had no idea what we were actually dealing with it. We excised the entire granulation tissue, and we could find a sac underneath having a cut, just a cut without any flaps. Now we sent this tissue for histopathological examination, and we found that the entire tissue was nasal mucosa. And when we compared this with another tissue site in case of primary DCR, we found this is the nasal upper picture shows that of the lacrimal sac mucosa, and the lower one shows that of the nasal mucosa. So you can very well make out that in this case the entire tissue was made up of nasal mucosa. Now coming to the outcome and follow-up. Now we had 49 eyes of 47 patients, out of which 11 cases were lost to follow-up. They didn't follow up after 1 week. So at the end of 3 months, we had 38 eyes, out of which one failed, and we had a success rate of 97.36. We were very happy. But when it comes to 6 months of follow-up, 27 eyes completed follow-up, and we had a success rate of 71.71%. And the mean follow-up period was 10.31 months, obviously less than 1 year, which is depicted in almost all the literature. But considering the scenario in our setting or in Indian setting, it's very important, it's very difficult to get a longer follow-up. Now, comparing our study with the study that had been conducted in 2011, 12, and 13, ours is a retrospective study. The inclusion criteria in all of the studies that included external, endoscopic, or traumatic, whereas we have included only external cases, excluding all other cases. The demographic pattern was similar to other cases.
Time is over.
The other surgeries, in all of the cases, it was a single surgeon, but we had a multiple surgeon involved, so that could have affected the surgical outcome. Now, to conclude, considering the statistics of 18% institutional cases versus 82% extra-institutional, 45% of the cases where the basics of surgery were not involved, and considering the overall success rate of 71%, I would recommend that an adequate focused training for external research required for young ophthalmologists. And to me, still, external DCR is the best technique, at least in my mind, at this stage of time. Thank you.
Our next. Endonasal endoscopic DCR in non-resolving acute dacryocystitis, Dr. Aditi Pujari.
Good afternoon, everybody. I shall be presenting our work on endoscopic endonasal DCR in acute non-resolving dacryocystitis. No financial relationships to disclose. Acute dacryocystitis can be defined as a medical urgency which is clinically characterized by rapid onset of pain, erythema, swelling, classically below the medial campus tendon with or without pre-existing epithura, mainly resulting from the acute infection of not only the lacrimal sac but also the perisac tissue. It can present as swelling, a combination of swelling and erythema, just the erythema, or it can present as lacrimal abscess, or rarely can present as a case of orbital cellulitis. The standard practice of management of acute dacryocystitis is conservative management with systemic antibiotics, systemic anti-inflammatory agents, and in cases of lacrimal abscess, percutaneous abscess drainage is performed. In another study done at our institute, the median time for resolution of the acute dacryocystitis was around 7 days, and 6% of the cases ended in a lacrimal fistula. The most common cause was spontaneous rupture of the lacrimal abscess. The causes of non-resolving acute dacryocystitis include progression of the acute dacryocystitis to lacrimal sac abscess, virulence of the organism, antibiotic resistance, and persistent inflammation in spite of resolution of the infection. There are a few disadvantages of the conservative treatment of acute dacryocystitis, which include prolonged or recurrent infection leading to orbital cellulitis or life-threatening cavernous sinus thrombosis, adverse antibiotic effects due to their long duration of use, aesthetic side effects like cutaneous scar or fistula, and failure of surgery due to scarring and granulation in sac. So we did a study to evaluate the safety and efficacy of endonasal endoscopy DCR in non-resolving acute dacryocystitis. It's a prospective interventional case series where we included the acute dacryocystitis cases not resolving completely with systemic antibiotics and few cases which had recurrent acute dacryocystitis in acute phase. Completely resolved acute dacryocystitis cases without any persistent inflammation were excluded from the study. We did the surgery under general anesthesia. At the beginning of the surgery, we infiltrated the nasal mucosa with a combination of xalocan and adrenaline and packed the nasal mucosa with xalocan adrenaline combination. You can see the decongestion of the nasal mucosa post packing which is very important because in these cases the inflammation will be really high. Decongestion will give us the space as well as it will reduce the bleeding. Now the nasal mucosal incision was taken with a sickle knife. Adequate incision needs to be taken to expose adequate amount of bone to do a large osteotomy. This is the nasal mucosa which is being reflected away from the underlying bone. After that, the nasal mucosal flap was cut. Now the osteotomy was started using the endonasal bone punches. It is very important to do the osteotomy very carefully in order to avoid any damage to the sac, because in acute bacterial cystitis even the sac will be very friable due to the inflammation. Now the sac incision was taken with the probe in place in the canaliculus so as to avoid any, here you can see the probe which is coming out. This avoids any damage to the canaliculus while taking the sac incision. The full thickness incision is confirmed with the drainage of the pus which was there. Now this is the 45 degrees probe tilt test which confirms that there is nothing in front of the common canaliculus which is going to obstruct. The mitomycin C was then applied, it was 0.02%, and even the circumosteal injection of the mitomycin C was done. Then the sac flap, which was anterior and posterior flaps, were glued or they were kept in place with the autologous serum, which generally comes after the bleeding. Now this is the bicanalular endonasal intubation, which is done by using the proper intubation tube. The intubation was done in all the cases and tube was kept in place for 6 weeks. The routine post-operative care was given in the form of antibiotics, systemic treatment as well as topical treatment. The patients were reviewed on post-operative day 1 week and post-operative 6 weeks. On 6 weeks visit, the tube removal was done and endonasal endoscopic examination of the ostium was done. We defined anatomical success as patency on irrigation and functional success was defined as absence of epiphora. We had 10 eyes of 10 patients, out of which 9 were females, and the age ranged from 8 years to 68 years. The 6 cases were non-resolving acute bacterial cystitis, whereas 4 cases had recurrent acute bacterial cystitis. There were no intraoperative or postoperative complications, but one patient had developed granulation tissue near the common canaliculus, which resolved in 6 weeks. All the cases had anatomical success, but 9 cases had functional success. On ostium evaluation after tube removal at the end of the 6 weeks, we observed that the ostium was large. All the ostia were large. They had large base. The most important thing was there was a mucosal contiguity with agar nasal and functional endoscopic dye appearance test. Like on endoscopy, when we put the fluorescent dye in the eye, the dye, with each blinking, the dye was appearing through the ostium. That showed even the functional success of the case. By seeing the aesthetic results, all the patients had gratifying aesthetic results without formation of any scar or any fistula, which is generally common at the when we have external DCR in acute bacterial cystitis. So to conclude, endoscopic DCR has potential use in cases with persistent or suboptimal response after medical treatment, and endoscopic DCR can be a good option in setting of acute bacterial cystitis. Thank you.
Thank you. With this, we conclude our session. Concluding remarks from our chairman.
I thank all of you here because many things have been discussed. I think we saw new things, relatively new, and the whole as it is a topic which has to be taken to a conclusion. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe it will give you something sharing here. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much. And maybe I think within 2 minutes we will be coming out with the best reports for both. Thank you.
The OCT has an optic disc acquisition protocol. However, this measures only the superficial nerve fiber layers. It does not measure the total retinal thickness. The OCT also has a macular cube acquisition protocol. This measures the total retinal thickness, but it measures only in the foveal and the perifoveal area. So if we were to center this macular cube acquisition protocol onto the disc, we will be able to measure the peripapillary total retinal thickness. That is, we will be able to measure the thickness in the peripapillary area. So it will help us in that, detecting early papillary edema due to increased thickness in this site. The objective of the study was to establish a normative data of the peripapillary total retinal thickness using the macular cube acquisition protocol. It is a study of 6 months now, from November 2012 to April 2013, with 58 subjects, 34 males and 24 females, with an average age of 46 years. The inclusion criteria was subjects above 20 years. Exclusion criteria was refractive error more than 6 diopters, which alters the OCT values, median opacities like cataract or corneal opacities, retinal nerve fundal pathologies, which will alter the retinal thickness. The subjects who met the criteria underwent a complete ophthalmic examination. The visual acuity was assessed. The posterior segment was evaluated using the 90 diopter lens to rule out any exclusion criteria. The OCT scanning was performed using the Cyrus HD OCT. The macular cube this time was centered on the disc and the picture was taken. The image quality was defined as satisfactory if the signal strength was more than 6 diopters and the centration of the disc was good. The OCT measures using a macular cube acquisition protocol in 4 sectors: the superior, the inferior, the nasal, and temporal. It measures this in 3 circles. We took the middle circle for the calculation of thickness because the middle circle corresponds to the immediate peripapillary area. So if we know the thickness of this site, we might be able to diagnose early papillary edema. This is a printout of the OCT with the macular cube acquisition protocol centered on the disc on a normal patient, a normal subject, and then one with an edema. You can see that there is increased subretinal fluid accumulation in this patient. Of 1169, we got an average in superior of 331, inferior 318, nasal 320, and temporal of 273. In short, the superior was the highest and the temporal was the least. In mild papillary edema, there is peripapillary subretinal fluid leakage as said earlier, leading to peripapillary total retinal thickness. So, we will be able to differentiate people with normal disc and those with early papillary edema. This methodology might also help, this normative data might also help in cases of optic atrophy. Because what happens in optic atrophy is that the retinal nerve fiber layer gets thinned out. It doesn't swell with raised ICP. However, there is accumulation of interstitial fluids in this peripapillary retinal area in case of raised ICP. So, if we use this protocol or this normative data, we will be able to monitor the changes in raised ICP in cases of optic atrophy. Added advantages are that we will help differentiate other causes of pseudopapillary edema like disc, crowded disc, tilted disc, and myelinated nerve fibers. conclude, normative data obtained from this study will help in future evaluation of optic disc in patients who come to us with suspected early papilledema using the OCT.
Was there any comparison with any other studies in literature?
We had taken the methodologies from an early literature which came in the British Medical Journal. The values, the added advantage and all were from many various literatures.
What I mean is the nerve fiber layer study in your case, in Indians, was it compared to nerve fiber layer studies in other countries? Any other literature that you took into comparison? Thickness of nerve fiber layer and the peripapillary or the total retinal
We didn't find any studies using the average values of this peripapillary thickness. Methodology was there. It was really corresponding. The temporal thinness was there, but the superior inferior thinning didn't.
So measurement of total peripapillary retinal thickness, as per you, there is not a study.
There is
For normative data.
one study is there, but normative data we didn't find it.
From India or abroad? That's what I mean.
My studies little based on the British Journal is there.
Okay, where was that study from?
London.
Okay, so that was a UK based study.
Yeah, it was not for normative data.
Okay.
They wanted to see if there is an early papillary accumulation of subretinal fluid.
Okay,
So
so not
they
for
found-
normative data.
No. So they found that there is a little accumulation. So we thought we'd use that in Indian context, and with this normative data help in differentiating early papillary. If anyone comes with a clear doubt of that, we can use OCT to confirm if we have a normative data.
Okay. Ravi, do you think this would give us, going to help us?
Right. Definitely, if there's a normative data, then you can diagnose optic atrophy, for example, or papilledema, as you mentioned, early papilledema, before you can diagnose it by slit-lamp dimicroscopy examination, etc. Certainly looks interesting, but I think the information is very, very early stages.
It's a nice initial study. It needs further inputs, and you should collaborate with other centers who are working in neuro-ophthalmology especially.
Actually, we were planning to increase the number of patients, but at the time of abstract submission, we had to give that testing. So we stopped at that, but we're still going on. We're trying to get in people with papilledema, and we have increased the number. We have crossed more than 150 now. So we're trying to get a better normative data because patient numbers are quite less. 59 is.
That's right. The normative data, that is very little. We need
Like abstract submission time.
a larger number, and of course, a good initiative. And how long do you plan to continue it, or is there a number of patients, limit on the number of patients?
Before I examine the second year, so before I complete my final year, I'm planning to sing the right.
Are you planning to submit it as a thesis?
No, not really.
No.
One thing I would like to ask, whether it is subretinal fluid you are just looking for, or the increased thickness of the nerve fiber layer?
Not nerve fiber layer, because that we can evaluate using the RNFL.
So many a times we see pseudopapilledema, but that nerve fiber layer is increased. So we cannot say that it is papilledema. We have seen cases that nerve fiber layer thickness on OCT is increased.
Yeah, in cases
But
like
on investigation that just your fluorescein angiography, there is no leakage, no symptomatology.
in cases like hypermetropia, the nerve fiber layer is increased due to the total retinal thickness. But the peripapillary area, in hypermetropia and all, the disc is, the nerve fiber layer is increased because of the crowding at the disc. But immediately after, around the disc, the thickness becomes almost normal because it's peripapillary area. So I think that in that context also this might help. And if it's a drusen, that earlier studies have shown in drusen, the optic disc findings are also different, not just elevation. They will be that irregular contour below the nerve fiber layer, and it abruptly ends that hyperreflective space. So actually, if we go further studies, I think it would be helpful in all these contexts because it's total retinal thickness, not just the superficial nerve fiber layer, and it's in the peripapillary area. The pseudopapilledema causes mostly are the crowd optic disc cannot causes thickness at the disc more at that level. we'll have to study that further.
Yeah, if you study, let's say, more than 1,000 patients or normal individuals, then you would probably detect all those variations of normal optic disc morphology, and in those you will get the crowded disc and pseudopapuloedema and all those things. So 1,000 or maybe 2,000, and then you can say that this normative data really applies to the general population, and then you can differentiate in patients with disc edema whether it is true disc edema or not.
Because we have seen cases coming to us with headache. MRI, MRV, everything is done, but nerve fiber layer is thickened. Disc is hyperemic, margins are blurred, and we are finding that on OCT nerve fiber layer thickness is there, but patient is asymptomatic.
In those specific cases, you may need to do a lumbar puncture and investigate the patient even more.
So we have done lumbar puncture also. That is the reason I am asking. We have done the lumbar puncture in those patients also. CSF pressure normal. There is no meningitis, nothing. Everything is normal. Came out to be normal, and there are cases.
Yeah, this is unusual case.
Unusual cases. Yeah.
Was it unilateral or bilateral?
Bilateral.
Just one question, whether you have compared with the spectroscopy or the conventional OCT, is there any difference here?
No, in our institution we have a status OCT, we have done only with that. We couldn't have convinced. I think so this OCT, because there are many institutions, if it comes to be good, I think it might be very helpful.
Now we would like to call upon Dr. Snehal Bonde Chaurasia to present her paper on role of total dose hyperfractionation in reducing risk of radiation-induced optic neuropathy. Okay, you are presenting. Okay. Presenting author is Mr. Vijay Jeswal. Dr. Vijay.
Good evening everyone, myself Dr. Vijay Jeswani, presenting here my study on role of total dose and hyperfractionation in reducing the risk of radiation-induced optic neuropathy. None of the authors has any financial interest whatsoever in this study. Coming to the introduction, radiation-induced optic neuropathy is one of the most disabling complications that may occur in patients treated with radiotherapy or head and neck cancer. It is caused by ischemia of the optic nerve, which leads to ischemic optic atrophy. Ischemic optic neuropathy is stratified as anterior or posterior depending on the location of the injury. If the ischemic lesion occurs distal to the lamina cratosa, that is involving optic nerve head, prelaminar and laminar parts of the optic nerve head will be remitted and it is classified as anti-RMN. In contrast, if the initial lesion occurs in the retrolaminar optic nerve and of optic chiasma, the optic nerve head will appear normal and the lesion is referred to as posterior RMN. Now, coming to this history. In 1994, Passan et al. Analyzed the treatment factors influencing the probability of developing RMN in a series of patients treated at the University of Florida between 1964 and 1989. Although a relatively small number of patients were treated with hyperfractionated radiotherapy, it appeared that ultrafractionation might be associated with the lower risk of RMN. Thus, the purpose of this study was to address the effect of total dose and hyperfractionation in the development of RMN. Between April 2012 and March 2013, 98 patients with tumors of the nasopharynx, nasal sinuses and nasal cavity were treated by cobalt teletherapy with curative intent at our institution in radiotherapy department. Patients were examined retrospectively around 1 year after radiotherapy completion. Patients were excluded if the optic nerves and optic chiasma were outside the treatment fields or near the field edge, the latter making accurate dose calculation difficult. If they had received prior radiotherapy to the same site, if they had any ocular or systemic disease affecting the optic disc, if they are taking chemotherapy, if they had visual problems before radiotherapy that could have contributed to the visual loss. A total of 98 patients fulfilled the selection criteria and were included in this analysis. Of these, 58 were men and 40 were women. Of the total 98 patients, the 28.57% of the patients were with nasopharyngeal tumors, 26.53% with paranasal sinus neoplasm, 23.46% with nasal cavity lesion, and 21.42% with palate malignancies. A complete ophthalmological evaluation of 98 patients were done with visual acuity, ECR chart, IDU, FFA, OCT, automatic perimetry, etc., irrespective of the development of visual problems. Of Of the total 19 patients, 9 patients developed RON in 39. Of the 9 patients, 3 developed anti-RON and 6 developed post-RON, indicating that the post-RON is more common than the anti-RON. Of the 9 patients, 5 developed unilateral RON and 4 developed bilateral RON. Of the total 19 patients, 58 patients were treated with conventional fractionation, that is once daily fractionation. Of the 58 patients, 8 developed RON. Of the 98 patients, 40 were treated with hyperfractionation, that is twice daily fractionation. Of these, only 1 patient developed RON, indicating that the hyperfractionation, the risk of development of RON is less with hyperfractionation. This table clearly shows that as the total dose increases, the development of risk of radiation-induced optic neuropathy increases, and also the hyperfractionation, the development of risk of radiation-induced optic neuropathy is less with hyperfractionation, that is twice daily hyperfractionation. This chart shows that the older age is the risk factor for the development of RON. This is the first photograph of radiation-induced optic neuropathy, with showing that this edema surrounding artery superficial hemorrhages with heart disease. This is the hereditary filter photograph. This is the ultimate stage, that is ischemic optic atrophy. Now coming to the discussion. Data pertaining to the risk of developing RIL after radiotherapy from head and neck tumors are relatively limited, because RIL is one of the most devastating complications that may occur after treatment. The identification of factors related to the development is important. Altered fractionation may be used to increase the tumor dose within a shorter overall time and reduce the dose per fraction to increase the tumor control and or reduce the risk of late complication. Our data showed a decrease in the occurrence of RIL after hyperfractionated compared with conventional fractionation. Because the initial target of the radiation level may be vascular endothelial tissue, hyperfractionation may reduce the risk of this injury and thus the likelihood of developing RIL. With the advent of intensity modulated radiotherapy, it is feasible to obtain a more conformal dose distribution and limit the tumor dose to the planning target volume while keeping the dose to the organs at risk below tolerance. Hung et al. Compared the treatment plans of patients with paranasal sinus tumors and observed significant sparing of the optic structures with IMRT. However, if the tumor abuts or surrounds the optic nerves or chiasma, IMRT cannot reduce the dose to these structures. Thus, when exclusion of the optic apparatus is not visible, altered fractionation, particularly hyperfractionation, should be considered. Thank you.
Well presented. The age group of your patient, these patients?
55 to 80 years. Because it is more common in the older age group. There are very less patients than below the 50 years of age.
Okay. Did you rule out systemic diseases?
Yes, systemic diseases which are affecting the optic disc.
For example, which diseases?
For example, tuberculosis, sarcoidosis, or some.
Okay, those you ruled out. What about diabetes, hypertension?
Diabetes, hypertension,
so
which affect the optic disc and the.
So amongst these 98 patients, there were no patients with diabetes or hypertension. Okay, that is very important because when you say ischemia, it also anterior ischemic optic neuropathy or even posterior occur in this age group, and the underlying risk factors are diabetes, hypertension. So you have to rule those out also, and so you cannot include those patients in this study. What I'm impressed about is the number of patients. So can you give us a little idea about the kind of center you are in? Yeah, I mean, what is the kind of tumor load? Do you have a cancer center there?
Yes, slowly have center for cancers.
Okay, so that's why you are so patient.
Just a couple of other comments. I think it's a nice study, very interesting study as well. Now, you have, being a retrospective study, you haven't possibly looked at statistical analysis. No,
it was a retrospective study.
But you only mentioned numbers. Yes. You have not looked at the statistical significance, because prima facie looks, if the groups are matched, that means the way you did the hyperfractionation versus regular, then there's obviously a very significant difference.
Yes.
So to be able to draw actually good data which you can use for your patients and actually stand and say that all your patients who are at risk of radiation retinopathy or radiation optic neuropathy must receive hyperfractionation.
Yes.
If you do the analysis. The second thing is that What is the difficulty if it's so good and you can do it easily? What goes against hyperfractionation? And what are the difficulties technically because the ophthalmology is standard? So you must tell the audience what really is the difficulty with doing it.
Patients living in the rural area are not willing for the twice daily cupping or thrice daily cupping. And so the complex of the patient is based with the hyperfractionation.
Yeah, but still,
Have you noticed other cranial nerve problems in these cases?
No, not other cranial
Only.
I want to ask you one question. You have said that IMRT is an advantageous position, but have you in your group, there is a EBRT, external beam radiotherapy patient was there, because this has a much more higher incidence of RION.
So we tried only covert therapy.
Okay.
So because I have an institution, only covert therapy is available.
Okay.
So we tried.
Any childhood tumor you have not taken?
No. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Vijay. Now I'd like to call Dr. Ambika from Chennai to present a paper on evaluation of IF against ELISA for detection of NMO-IgG antibody in severe optic neuritis. Dr. Ambika.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk about the evaluation of IIF against ELISA in detection of AQP4 antibodies for optic neuritis. The aim is to emphasize the importance of doing this assay in addition to comparing these two assays in detection of these AQP4 antibodies. I don't have any financial interest, and we all are aware very much that optic neuritis can be associated with one of these two deadly CNS disorders which are demyelinating basically in nature, and optic neuritis can be a formicrestry of one of these two. And in our part of the country, we also have to, adding to the confusion, OSMS, which is another variant of MS. And coming to the treatment of optic neuritis per se, we are aware that IV steroids is a very good gold standard treatment. But what happens when we come across a poor outcome optic neuritis, when we get recurrent neuritis patients? So the next line of therapy can be one of these two, either an immunomodulatory therapy or an immunosuppressive therapy, which is generally offered as a line of management by the neurologist. When clinically we do not have any evidence along with the MRI proven evidence of these two diseases, it is slightly difficult to be a group of optic neuritis patient. So that is the aim of going into this particular antibody assay, just to stratify which one of them can be heading towards one of these two disorders. Ever since Vandadena has come up with this antibody in 2004, and Venkachak used this as one of the supportive criteria to detect NMO, the importance of this antibody is in vogue. So we did this in our Medical Research Foundation. We took almost 50 patients, 23 of them were controls, are uneventful cataract patients, and 25 patients were optic neuritis, proven demyelinating optic neuritis patients by all the clinical evaluations. So we included only the recurrent and bilateral optic neuritis patients and those with a poor visual outcome by at least by 4 to 6 weeks, that is less than 660. And we excluded the other causes of optic neuritis, optic neuropathies by detailed blood and other evaluations as and when needed. And after an ethical approval, we use these two kits for the comparison. One is an immunofluorescence and other is an ELISA kit. Coming to the ELISA results, among the 25 optic neuritis patients, severe ones, we got almost 12 of them were positive and 13 of them were negative. And this is the way titer evaluation is used in case of an ELISA, the titer ranging from this. And if it is an IIF, the positive results are read by a fluorescent microscope as it is shown here, the positive and the negative details. So when we try to compare both the assays our patients, we found that almost all the patients, among the 12 patients of ELISA positivity, one of them turned out to be negative even after the re-assay. And rest of the other patients, all negative, were even negative on an immunofluorescence. So the main important fact here is the clinical diagnosis, which acts as the gold standard to rule out a selection bias in getting this assay, because it has been well proven in the literature that isolated optic neuritis may not be that useful in getting this aquaporin assay done. And NMO antibody is definitely more specific, more than 99%. The sensitivity will vary depending upon the assay used. Definitely superior assays are the cell-based assays, but there are also assays with purified protein and cell lysates and ELISAs which are available. And this is one particular tabular column which I found that which has compared all the assays, sensitivity and specificity. And in this, there's a Japanese article which is quoting the last one, which is showing almost 71% sensitivity with ELISA and 98 for the specificity, whereas IIF will range from 50 plus to 70 plus, and invariably they are all significantly specific. And this literature article from Neurology 2013 is confirming that aquaporin antibody positivity has to be included in the spectrum of NMO spectrum disorders, though we do not have a clinically proven or an MRI features for NMO. And again, this is the latest autoimmune optic neuropathy, which has been an article which has come out in Autoimmune Review by Dr. Plant et al., which is also confirming that testing these antibodies in all the severe cases is very vital for us to decide the next line of therapy. So in our experience, both ELISA and fluorescence were reliable and reproducible techniques, and immunofluorescence has definitely an advantage because it's simple, less time consuming compared to the ELISA, which is quite laborious. And the disadvantage, we need a proper person, experienced persons to do it, and a fluorescent microscope. We calculated the sensitivity, which came almost to 70 plus, and the specificity was 90 plus in the immunofluorescence, whereas definitely ELISA sunk in the sensitivity and specificity as compared with the fluorescence. So to conclude, recurrent and bilateral optic neuritis is very important to be screened for this AQP4 assessment. Though ELISA is not a sensitive tool, it can be an alternative as a screening tool from the neurophthalmic perspective. And since we didn't have any Indian data so far in the literature to compare this, we thought we will create one literature for our own patients who are going into this group. And we started all these patients who were positive for AQP4, we refrained them from going from IMAs, which are considering them to be a potential NMO-SC patients. I take this opportunity to thank my microbiology department who has been thick and thin with me with this essay. Thank you.
So, Ambika, what is the final test that you're using now?
We are actually using now immunofluorescence as of now. And the sensitivity, what we have found, is likely to be much better when we come up with this particular group of recurrent and severe optic neuritis patients.
And cost effective?
Yes, it is cost effective definitely compared to the other assays. Which are I tried a survey finding where else in India they are doing this type of assays, but I could not get any cell-based assays available in India. And modified cell-based assay, you have to get the HEK cell lines to be maintained. Actually, you can't use the transfected ones from the animal models. They don't sustain in the lab. So we have to create one which is not available as of now in India. And there are a couple of studies which have used this assays, but they have sent the sample to Mayo Clinic. There is a manual registry which have quoted aquaporin assay, but they have sent the sample. I don't know how much it would have costed for the patient. Sending the sample and how soon you get the result. When you are sitting, when you are having a patient in a room, then we have to think. I think this is a simple alternative tool because we are not neurologists who are going to treat them based on this. They don't have clinical features. They don't have MRI proven evidence of being MS or NMO. They may be just down the line within a year, they may develop one of these diseases. But putting them into interferons and ultimately they ending up to an NMO spectrum disorder, I think it's definitely not acceptable from our point.
So if we take a subgroup of patients who have either recurrent optic neuritis or bilateral optic neuritis or optic neuritis not responsive to steroids, and we have ruled out all other systemic illnesses or causes, in your experience, how many of them come out positive with NMO antibodies?
Almost, we did an earlier study with ELISA. We did almost for 40 patients, out of which we had 20% of them being positive. And the best thing is all were females, which were almost, our results were incomparable to a Japanese study and a Chinese study, which they have also looked into this perspective. We had, out of the 40 patients, we had 8 patients positive for this, and all the 8 were positive for ANA also. And 3 of them succumbed, in fact, to the cervical signals what they had, and they developed in due course. And in fact, many of them were being treated elsewhere as MS. And after being treated MS, just because they are recurrent optic neuritis. So that's the only.
So in such a subgroup of patients, 1 in 5 turns out to be NMO positive.
when we select that particular group of patients
Only that particular
with poor outcome
poor outcome,
exactly. Who are negative for
normal MRI, normal MRI and all.
normal MRI, only optic nerve signals, and all blood negative for all autoimmune disease.